A friend of mine once told me a story about attending church on All Saints' Day. The preacher stood up and started the sermon by asking everybody to turn to their neighbor and introduce themselves by saying, "Hi, I'm Saint so-and-so." So he did. He turned to his neighbor and said, "Hi, I'm Saint Jonathan." To which his friend snickered at him and said, "No, I don't think so." What does it mean to be a saint? Does it involve an extreme sense of religious purity? Is being a saint about being so holy that even Jesus puts on sunglasses when he looks at us? Is the term reserved for only a certain class of people? Is it about being more spiritual, or should we say spiritually better than the next person? We might think so. It's easy to think that way. And when we do, we put the bar so high that essentially nobody can ever assume that they meet it. Is that the correct definition of a saint? Or is it maybe the opposite? Are we all saints? Is being a saint mean that no matter what, we can all introduce ourselves as Saint Joan or Saint Milton or Saint Carmen? Or is the term to refer to absolutely every person, regardless of their level of relationship with God or commitment to Jesus? But if the first definition put the bar so high that nobody could meet it, does this set the bar so low that the definition doesn't really mean anything anyway anymore? Or could it be somewhere in the middle? Could being a saint be something that we have to strive towards? Tangible, yes, but striving towards also. So on this All Saints' Day, let's look at what it means to cultivate a saintly life. And I think our reading from Colossians has some good words for us. Cultivating saintly life involves two primary things. So if you look at this passage before us in Colossians chapter 1, what you see is that this passage is part of a larger section of Paul's prayer of thanksgiving. And he's praying for the Colossian people. He has heard of their faith in Jesus. He has heard of their love for others and how the message of Jesus is producing a change in people's lives. Now, the Colossian people, they're not perfect. Far from it. And Paul's going to get to some of those issues later in his letter, but here he offers a prayer for them. Our reading begins, "For this reason, since the day we heard it, we heard of your faith and all that kind of stuff, we have not stopped praying for you." Right? Paul's talking about a wider Christian community in this letter. He's writing on behalf of others. And so if we take into consideration that Paul may in some way represent a saintly life, we do call him St. Paul after all, then here we see the first thing involved in cultivating a saintly life: prayer. Paul is praying for the Colossian people. And the people that he represents, the Christian community that he represents, they are praying for the Colossian people. Now again, we might feel that this sets the bar kind of low, right? Well, if that's it, that's pretty easy, you might say. Right? Anybody can pray for anybody else. Do you remember the show, The Romper Room? I'm dating myself, but The Romper Room. It always ended with someone looking through a magic mirror and saying, "I see Lisa, I see David, I see Solomon." You never saw Kyle, by the way. That was my only bone of contention with the show. The Kyle never showed up. But, they see all these people. Well, is that what prayer is? Right? Just this kind of romper room rattling off of names? No. Paul has specific content to his prayer. "For this reason, we have not stopped praying for you," he says, "asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of God's will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding." Paul prays that the Colossian people experience the presence of Jesus in a deeper way. His desire, his focus, his intention is not simply to lift up random names, but it's to present people to Jesus, asking the Spirit of God to fill their lives with his presence. Now that's a much different prayer. Because what it speaks to is our desire to see other people come to faith. Paul's prayer for the Colossians isn't so that he can feel great about his saintly life, but it's so that, as he says, you may live lives worthy of the Lord, pleasing to him, as you bear fruit and grow in the knowledge of God. Paul wants them to grow. Right? I want you to know the activity of Jesus in your life, he prays. I want you to know how much you please him. I want you to grow in your relationship with God. I want you to bear fruits of the Spirit, he says. Right? This isn't about me. This is all about you. This is about your connection with Jesus, and I want that to go more and more and more, to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, when Paul says, I want you to bear fruit, this is my prayer that you bear fruit. Scripture often uses that language, and we often hear it wrongly, because we hear this as a demand to certain activity. Bearing fruit, we say, is how we prove our love for God, and if we just try harder, we bear more fruit. However, when a branch bears any type of fruit, if you think about kind of a grapevine with grapes, it doesn't do so by the strength of its own will. The branch doesn't think, if I just try harder, I can produce really good grapes. I think I will. No. Right? The fruit is produced out of the life which flows into the branch from the vine. So to produce fruit in our lives, and if we're using the language that we use in Scripture, which is the fruit of the Spirit, if to produce the fruit of the Spirit, the fruit of faith in our lives, it is to have the Spirit of God so working in us, to be flowing through us, that our lives change. Kind of organically. So Paul prays not that the Colossians try harder, but that the Spirit of God so move through them that the Spirit's presence becomes evident in their lives in a natural and organic way. May you be made strong, he prays, with the strength that comes from his glorious power. See, the Colossians, they're just all recipients. He's not asking them to do anything. He's asking them to receive more of Jesus, to receive more of the Spirit. And so finally, he prays that they give thanks to God. The only thing he asks them to do is that by being immersed in the Spirit, by getting to know Jesus more, he prays that you will grow to give thanks to God, who has enabled you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light through redemption and the forgiveness of sins. That you will recognize that through this process of getting to know Jesus, you will recognize who Jesus is for you, and you will give thanks for him. So that's Paul's prayer. And that's to be our prayer. That the presence and activity of Jesus be increased in people's lives. That they experience Jesus more deeply. That their lives change because of what Jesus has done for them and continues to do in them and through them. And that becomes an important question, I think, for us. In your prayer life, do you pray that others know Jesus? Do you pray for a person in your sphere of influence, right? A family member, maybe friends, even just the person who cuts your hair, right? Your hairdresser. Do you pray that they experience Jesus in your life? Do you pray that they come to faith? If we are to take Paul's example here, what we see is that cultivating a saintly life, or we might say cultivating saintly prayer, is about wanting others to get to know Jesus and praying that they do so. Now, earlier, I said that this reading shows us two things about cultivating a saintly life. The first is praying for others, praying for people in our lives to get to know Jesus. The second is to do something about it. Well, what does Paul do here? He's writing a letter, right? It's called a letter to the Colossians, is what we're reading today. We're reading Paul's mail. Paul's whole point in the letter is to help the Colossians recognize who Jesus is. And the point here is that Paul is acting out the very prayer that he has deep within him. Praying for others is absolutely great, and there is power in prayer. But sometimes we use prayer as an easy way out. Right? We don't want to step out of our comfort zones. Well, so we will pray privately in our lives as a way to kind of avoid doing something more outward or active. Right? But Jesus calls us to be witnesses, and he empowers us to be witnesses. That's what we see before the ascension. Jesus breathes on the people and says, "Receive my Spirit." That's what we see at Pentecost, where the Spirit descends and empowers the Christian community to share the word of faith. God calls us to step outside of the comfort boundaries of our rooms and share the presence of Jesus in the world. And the biggest way that people recognize the presence of Jesus is by observing Jesus in our lives. The biggest way that people recognize the truth of who God is by recognizing God work in our lives. And we may not know how this works out all the time, but we can be sure that it will never happen if we don't take the step and try to help people know Jesus. There's a wonderful story of the evangelist D.L. Moody. D.L. Moody had 100 friends who he knew didn't know Jesus. They weren't people of faith, but they were his friends, but they didn't have an active relationship with God. And so he set out to pray for them every single day. Now, we need to know, these were his friends, so Moody didn't just pray for them. He didn't just sit in his room and do the romper room prayer. I pray for Billy, I pray for John. He didn't do that. He also interacted with their lives. He talked with them, he encouraged them, he invited them to meetings. These were his friends after all. But all of it was rooted in this heartfelt prayer that these people know and experience the love and the forgiveness of Jesus. That Jesus was so important that they needed to know him. And by the time Moody died, 96 of those 100 people had become Christians. What's more astounding is that at Moody's funeral, the final 4 became Christians as well. I just saw on Facebook a friend of mine posted a letter or an email that he had just received about 15 years later from somebody who was in his youth group when he was a youth leader, thanking him for his influence on their lives. When we prayerfully interact with the people around us, longing, wanting, desiring, praying for others to get to know Jesus, we never know how the Spirit will work and what may happen. Now, I'm not saying that you need to develop a list of 100 people. Can you have 5? Can you even think of one? Do you have one person that you think that their lives would be enriched if they knew Jesus in a deeper way? And who is the name that just popped into your head? Could you make that your saintly prayer? Could you give yourself every single day to having a focused, desired prayer that that person get to know Jesus more? But if you make your saintly prayer, recognize that just like St. Paul and like St. Moody, you are also called to be an active agent in the realization of that prayer. So could you recognize that the way that Jesus reveals or may reveal himself to that one person might involve revealing himself in you or through you? See, this is what it means to be a saint. It's not about being so holy that you remove yourself from others. It's about being someone who has the yearning that others know Jesus and who willingly allows God to use them to help others get to know him more. So may the Lord bless you as you lift up your saintly prayer again and again and again and witness to the presence of Jesus in your saintly life. Amen.